Welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast. I'm Amy, wife, mother of two and homemaker. Come along with me as I share my love for simple living, growing in my allotment garden, diving into what it means to be an urban homesteader and embracing life as a mother and homemaker. Welcome back to another episode of the Slow Living Collective podcast. Today we have a special guest joining us, and that's Beckie from Our Nurtured Life. Beckie is a busy business owner and mother who has embarked on the beautiful journey of embracing slow living, and she believes in creating a life filled with intention, mindfulness and balance, even in the midst of a hectic schedule. So in this episode, we'll dive into the topic of slow living as a busy business owner and mother and explore how Beckie has integrated these principles into her own life and also the profound impact it has had on her overall well-being. So grab a cup of tea or coffee or water or whatever the tipple of your choice is, find a comfy spot and get ready to be inspired by Beckie's wisdom and insights on navigating the busy yet rewarding journey of motherhood, being a busy business owner, and all the while embracing the power of slow living. So, hi Beckie, welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. So before we get into it, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone? Tell us who you are and what it is that you do.
Thanks, Amy. Yep, I'm Beckie. I live in Winchester in Hampshire, and I am a mummy to one little boy called Edward, who is 3. And I run a company called the Charity Spark. So we work with charities and nonprofits across the UK to help them evaluate what they do. And that means that they are able to prove that they do what they say they do, and then use that insight to generate more money and effective strategy for their future.
That sounds amazing. That does sound incredible. And it's your own business, am I right?
Yeah, that's right. So I set it up in 2019. Well, the inspiration for it was I was working as a fundraiser and as a development manager. So in a development manager role in a charity, you're responsible for the income generation, you're responsible for the evaluation, often the program development with the sort of frontline staff. And I loved working in the charity sector, but I was married, fairly newly married, and we were thinking about family time and family life. And I didn't know what I wanted to do post children, but I knew that freelancing in the charity sector could be an option post baby. And then my husband and I were on a very belated honeymoon because he was in the Navy at the time and they'd only given him the weekend off for the wedding. So we went on honeymoon a few months later, and I was sat in in this amazing place, and I was saying, I just think I'm going to really enjoy freelancing, but I just don't know what this is going to look like and how long it's going to take us to conceive and all these things. And my husband said, just go for it now. We don't know how long these things are going to take. This could be just a pipe dream that you hold on to for years and years. So why don't you just go for it? And I recognized that we were enormously privileged because we could afford for me to take that leap because we could live on my husband's salary. So I came back, handed my notice in. Actually, there was one step before. I basically said, if I can get 1 or 2 clients lined up pre-handing my notice in, I'll feel much more comfortable. So I started talking to people who knew me in the sector, and a couple of people came back and said, if you're serious, then we've got some work for you. So I gave my notice and jumped in both feet first into what was named the Charity Spark. And initially it was just me, a real traditional sort of freelancer role, working for a few different clients and different charities. And then I found out I was pregnant with Edward, and I thought, oh, well, okay, that was quicker than we thought. We'd been trying for a little while, actually, so that the process hadn't been quick, but the realization, I wasn't expecting it to be quick once I'd actually started the business, because it had taken that long so far to get to the point that we weren't pregnant. And that's why my husband was like, well, look, we just don't know what this journey is going to be like. It's already not quite the journey we'd expected. So it was a real surprise to then find out I was pregnant naturally a week before our fertility clinic. But that was a huge gift. So there I was going, okay, well, I'm going to do this for the first 10 months of running a business. And then I went on maternity leave, which was February 2020, and we all know what happened 5 weeks later.
I came off maternity leave in March 2020, and it was like, I'm back to nothing.
Exactly. It was not quite what you expected, I'm sure. And it certainly wasn't the maternity leave I was expecting.
No, I can imagine.
But there we go. But it did give me the opportunity to think. And when I came back, I changed the business model slightly, and we've now got staff members.
Fantastic. So today we're going to talk about slow living, what that looks like for you, and how slowing down and living a bit more simply can really be applied to everybody in every situation. Because I think there is, this misconception that we can't have everything, right? That we can't have a career and still live a slow and simple life, that they don't quite mesh together. And I talk a lot on this podcast, particularly about being more of a homemaker and a stay-at-home mother first and foremost, which is something that I came from a freelance background as well. And for me, I felt after the birth of my son, when that sort of period of maternity leave had ended, I felt really uncomfortable. Like I didn't know where I sat because I knew I wasn't going to go back to what I did. And so, yeah, I just had to sit with being really uncomfortable for a while because I just didn't know what I wanted. But yeah, so I'm really excited to hear what your perspective on slow living, because obviously mine at the moment is predominantly, homemaking and being that stay-at-home parent. I'm going to home educate my children. And so, you have a different perspective. You're running a successful business, and I'm really excited to dive into it with you. So like I said, I think there can be the assumption that living slowly or simply is just doing things at a bit of a slower speed. Whereas I guess I prefer to think a bit more about just being mindful with the tasks that I'm doing, the things that I either do, or maybe some things that I just opt not to do, that they just don't fit. And finding the things that I find are important and things that aren't. So how would you describe what slow and simple living means to you?
It's such a good question. And I probably feel slightly like a fraud at the moment because I don't feel like life is particularly slow in the last couple of months. But I have a yearning for it to be. And that's what I always sort of would say, is that I feel like it's a soul direction. So mindfulness is really, I think that's a really key thing for me. It's like the way that I do things. But also for me, it's about simplicity and trying to find a pathway that feels like it's fueling me and giving me energy, rather than just being, a list of things I need to get done. And I think, in the interest of transparency, probably right now, I'm coming out of a burnout period and I'm trying to rebalance because I didn't get it right over the last few months. And I think that's partly because I've been working actually more like full-time hours, probably more than full-time hours, and desperately needed the backup in the business. And I am a bit of a workaholic, so left unchecked, I'll just keep going. But I think that what's really important to me about sort of slow or simple living is about finding the joy in things that perhaps are something that can provide you with, like I said, like that energy, a bit of direction. And for me, it's connection to something. So I really love creating. I love creating, whether that's in the kitchen or the garden or crafting or doing something, like you said, sort of homemaking. That really does invigorate me, and it makes me feel calmer and like I have a purpose. And I think the periods of my life where I've been happiest, and some of my kind of happiest core memories, are rooted in creating, often in a very simple way from scratch, and also typically with people who really, really value that as well. So I don't think that's a very succinct answer, but I do think it can sit alongside a work life and a busy family life. But I have to be really, really careful about holding space for that and actually putting boundaries in it, around it. And I haven't been great at that the last few months. And that does affect my mental health as well as my energy levels.
Yeah, and you saying that brings up a really good point, that sometimes we don't always get it right either. Sometimes sometimes you might find me in the kitchen and like, somebody like casually glancing my Instagram might be like, look at Amy, she's baking her sourdough, she's making this, she's making that. And sometimes, you know what, I'm sitting like a slug on my sofa and, I'm just not in the zone. And I don't feel like you say, I don't have that connection. And it's just like refinding that. And, I don't always get it right. And we don't always get it right.
And if it doesn't bring you joy, then I think it's missing the point. And I
Yeah.
don't mean that in a kind of Marie Kondo way. I just mean that if you feel like your pursuit of slow living and simple living is just really painful and really hard work, then have you got the right things in order? Have you got the right tools and resources? Right now, I have no sourdough starter on the go because I realized that I was so stressed about maintaining my healthy sourdough starter and then baking with it and not creating waste, because something that's really important to me as part of my journey in slow living and simple living is about our sustainability as a family. But if I'm trying to pursue sourdough making and I haven't got the routine for it at the moment, and I'm then wasting loads of sourdough starter because I'm not making the kind of bread, and then you think, that's just really kind of counterintuitive. And I think, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but that thing about, Instagram and other even blogs, and these are people's highlights
Yeah,
reels.
absolutely.
These are the things they
Absolutely.
want to put out. And so,
Yeah.
absolutely do these things if they bring you joy, if they bring you energy, and if it's the right thing for you and your family, but don't feel beholden to it, because then it's no better than a job.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of sourdough, as an example as well, my sourdough starter is currently dead. Um,
We
and I
can all be honest about killing sourdough.
Yeah, I was talking to my husband yesterday in the car, and we were listening to another podcast that I listened to, and I put it on while we were driving, and it was talking about like sourdough and homesteading, and I was like, I just said to him, I don't know, like I love making sourdough like things out of the discard, like that's easy for me to, have a bit of an active starter, make some sourdough discard crackers, make chuck it in some pancakes, chuck it in some waffles. I don't have the time to be like stretching and folding dough and having to think 18 hours before I want to bake a loaf of I don't have it's too much of a mental load combined with all of the other things, and it's like you say, if it's not going to serve you, then is it that important? Because you know what, other bread is available and it's fine.
Yeah, literally. And actually, a quick loaf of bread, which my granny taught me to do, which does still need time to be kneaded and, risen and things, but it's just a little bit more low maintenance.
Yeah. And
It's
so
still free of all the nasties. It's still free of the sugar and things. And actually, that's a really beautiful loaf of bread. And I think, I really agree. I think do it if you love it. Do it if it's bringing you joy and if it's adding something to your day. But if it's just another thing to put on the list of things you need to achieve by bedtime,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not slow living.
it's not, and it's stressful. There's been times where I've already been in bed, I fed my son to sleep, I'm about to go to sleep myself, and I'm like, oh, I haven't fed the sourdough starter. I have to get up, I have to find my glasses, I have to get down there. And you know what? Then that becomes stressful. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it's not the be all and sourdough isn't the be all and end all of slow living.
No,
You can live a slow and simple life without sourdough bread. And if you do
I
enjoy
do.
it, fine. But yeah, we have a bread maker, and I love just chucking the ingredients in, let before I go to bed, let it do its thing, and then there's a loaf of bread in the morning. And I don't do it every day. And
No, I think there's a tool that I often use with some of my clients. And I know this sounds really kind of jargony, but it's the 5 whys. And I think when I started to think about where the rebalance needed to happen in my life and how I could get more back to a life which cherished the slow and simple living elements, it was the 5 whys. And it's basically saying, let's, take anything, for example, like baking bread. It doesn't necessarily have to be salad baking bread. And say, but why? Why do you want to bake a loaf? And then the answer might be, because I enjoy the process. But why? Oh, because it's important to me. But why? And you ask why 5 times, and normally you get to the core reason for doing it. And it's sort of that theory of saying, well, just keep testing that. So for me, baking bread is something that I find quite therapeutic. I like the fact that I'm able to provide for my family something that is, has been done for generations, but also is actually so much better for them than what is I can purchase in the shops. And if that's my core why about health and well-being, and also passing on heritage traditions and things like that, that's a really good reason for doing it. And it's okay if all I do then is once a month bake a load of loaves that go in the freezer.
Yeah, yes.
And that's because that's actually having the same impact. So I found like part of my, the last month or so, really thinking about what is it that I cherish and what is it about slow and simple living that I want to embed in our family, and to really kind of reinvest in how I love to live. And sometimes it's about finding ways of doing that that's going to serve that real core why. So feeling like I'm providing something really nourishing for my family, but also doing it in a modern way, which says, do you know what, actually it's going to be more time efficient for me to do this in one day and fill the freezer up.
Yes,
because
yes.
I'm still going to feel the same about bringing that loaf of bread out of the freezer, but I'm not going to feel the pressure of trying to do it every day. So I know it's like a bit of a kind of jargon thing, but I find that quite useful when I'm trying to be introspective into what is it I actually want to be doing.
Yeah, and in the modern world we have busy lives, and it's okay not to be baking bread every day. Like, I certainly couldn't find time to bake bread every day, and sometimes I buy it from the supermarket when it's necessary.
That's okay.
Yeah, and that's okay too. We're just doing our best. That's all we can do.
Absolutely. And what's that phrase? We don't need everybody to be perfect. We need 100 people to be imperfect, but
Yeah.
having the same mindset. And that's a big one in sustainability. And for me, that's something else that slow and simple living is about. It's about trying to be more low impact and trying to kind of help our family to live a really like nourished life. I've also been reading lots about the kind of protection of child mental health, and about how I don't know if you find this, but I'm 33, so in my teenage years I started secondary school in 2000, and we didn't have MSN Messenger in 2000, but a couple of years later we did, and then we had MySpace, and then we had Facebook. I don't think I got until I was 18, so about 2007. But life has got noisier and noisier and noisier. And some of the things that I cherish the most from my childhood were every Sunday, my dad, who's an amazing cook, both my parents are brilliant cooks, but my dad was a cook for leisure. My mum always said, she had to cook because she needed to feed the children.
Yeah.
With my dad, so on a Sunday, we'd be in the kitchen with him, we'd be helping the roast dinner, we'd be making puddings, we'd be baking, and we would go to my granny and granddad's house where there was a little orchard, and we would get apples. And all of my kind of most favorite childhood memories are around creating these like family meals and learning how to do things in a really traditional way, and sewing and knitting. And I know that sounds so cliched, but I was thinking about what I want my child's childhood to be like. And then I was reading about the protecting them from like digital noise. And we're really aware of screen time and the impact that can have on a growing brain. And I'm the first to say that Thomas the Tank Engine is a massive favorite in our house, as is Fireman Sam.
Fireman Sam here. Fireman Sam, sometimes parents.
Fireman Sam, Thomas the Tank Engine, and a bit of Julia Donaldson, and he's happy. And of course he watches television, but we are really mindful of what he's watching and how often he's watching it. And I think that's because I would much rather he's outside in the garden or in the kitchen with me, or like today he wanted to clean, so I gave him a water spray bottle. I mean, I regretted it when the kitchen floor was and I'm not like, this isn't a pious thing, I'm not getting this right, but it's part of my desire to be realigning with a slow and simple life, is how can I protect his mental health? Because I think our generation have been hit really hard by the rise of digital. because there's no manual for it, and it was always, it was moving faster than safeguarding could keep up. It was moving faster than schools and parents could keep up. And I think we're starting to be much more mindful about what children have access to, but that's in response to a generation of really dodgy kind of digital and kind of interaction. So I think that we have such a huge responsibility to try and protect their little brains, and that for me is a real force, a driving force for wanting to work out how we balance everything at home.
Yeah, so I'm 38, so just a little bit older than you. And the same, like if you think about like our childhood was like, technology free. I mean, I remember when we got internet when I was 16, I think, and we had dial up, and like nobody else could call because you just got the engaged tone. Like that was amazing to me. And then, I didn't get a phone till I think I was 16 when I got a phone, but it was, like a very basic phone. And I remember I saved up and got it myself, and then I like paid for the credit to go on it. And like now we have, like these little computers at our fingertips. And, I just can't imagine, like everything has gone so fast. And, like, so, my previous career was in social media. So like I'm very acutely aware, even through things like running my blog now, doing this podcast, I am acutely aware of how much time I spend doing social media related tasks. And even though I consider it like somewhat of a job in terms of like, doing the podcast, getting it done and getting it out and everything, yeah, I'm really aware of how much so goes into that, but then how much I'm spending, with like blue light in my face all the time. We're the same. I'm not going to say my children don't have screen time, because they absolutely do, and they're not feeling that great today. And so it was a cartoons for most of the day today. But same, just try and get them outside and in nature. They love being outside. They love nothing more than digging a hole, or you know pulling up my flowers, things like that.
Oh,
come
exactly.
to come to the allotment, and then they show me, so that I look what I've just pulled up, and I'm like, oh, I just planted that.
Yeah. I found Edward digging over the top of the potatoes the other day.
So I know when we were discussing this episode, we both noted that we approach slow living from a different place. You're a successful business owner, and I've largely paused my career to be home and home educate my children. But I think it's really important to discuss how both are incredibly valid options, and neither is a barrier to entry when it comes to slowing down. And I know the listeners of this podcast, they often hear what slow living looks like from my perspective. So voices like yours are also powerful to show, that you can have a career and it doesn't mean you can't slow down and enjoy your career at the same time. So how would you say you approach slowing down in terms of your career and everything that surrounds that?
It's such a good question. And I think, so like I admitted earlier, I think it hasn't quite been in the right place recently. It's been all a bit hectic. But I do have some kind of intentions around it. And I think the education piece is really interesting as well. What are we going to do around educating? We've got one son at the moment. He's 3. So this autumn we'll be at that kind of school place discussion, and what does that look like? And I really, really admire the fact that you've taken that decision to home educate, because I think there's so much value in that. And I really love the Scandinavian system of, it being a much later decision because they just look so small at 4 going into school. So I think we haven't made any hard decisions yet about school, but I think it's likely that he'll be traditionally educated in some form, although we have started to look at like what alternative provisions there are around here as well. Unfortunately, we don't have like a Waldorf Steiner school or something lovely like that, which would be my dream, would be to have that.
Yeah.
And I think the nearest one is the New Forest, which is a little bit of a drive away. It could still be a consideration. It's just then you're going to add in quite a hefty commute each way, which there has to be a kind of consideration whether that's the right thing as well. I think, I grew up in a village where I went to the village school, and I've got really fond memories of the independence of walking to school and of spending time with my friends after school. And we were very, very lucky with that little school. It was very dreamy in lots and lots of ways. And I recognize that the school system 30 years later is not quite the same anymore. But we will be making like a real concerted effort to find the right school for Edward. And that might not be it's probably not going to be our catchment school, for example. And I think, we are in the position of knowing what we want his environment to look like and his education to look like. And if we can find something that feels right for us in the traditional school sector, then that will probably be the route we take. But knowing that is to enable me to carry on working, I suppose, and which gives us other things as a family. So I guess there's kind of some compromises here. Like, we have a dream of probably in the first kind of primary phase of his education, potentially taking some extended time away as a family, educating him on the road, potentially doing some kind of trip like that. And that will be facilitated by the fact that because I'm working, we have the financial freedom to do that.
Yeah.
So I think, I think there are ups and downs with this whole journey, aren't there? And I'm really aware of the failings of our school system. And I was talking to my mum about this, who's very wise. And
Mums are.
mums are. And she said, I think it's been something that I've talked to her often about, all sorts of different things in motherhood. They're kind of like, am I making the right decision? Is this the right thing for my child? I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. And she always says to me, the fact that you're worrying about it and the fact that you're aware of like the pros and cons means you're going to be working twice as hard to overcome them. And for some people, that looks like your decision to say, actually, for this period, I don't have any good options around me, and I'm going to pause and we're going to home educate, which is amazing. And I think one of the reasons we live where we do is because we actually we looked at the schools before we looked at the house. So we kind of sought out somewhere where we would have some really good options, both state and independent. And we hadn't made a decision at that point where he would go, but we knew that we would need lots of options around us. So I guess whilst that's still a question to be answered, I think we're probably leaning more towards him starting school in a primary close to us, although not our catchment one that we've kind of identified as close to our values and our ethos, and we'll see how it goes. But we have got a very big, we will be seeing how this goes, and if we don't feel it's the right environment for his learning, then we'll definitely be revisiting that conversation. And I think in the meantime, being able to work in the way that I do, yeah, it's quite full on, and I'm definitely not living the slowest life in terms of my career at the moment. But that is a conscious decision because of the opportunities we feel like it's going to give us as a family. So my husband works full-time and I work full-time hours, but not in a traditional 9 to 5. I have 4 days of childcare, which is a lot. So I have he has a day with my mother-in-law, which is just wonderful, 2 days at nursery, which are long days, and then 1.5 days at preschool, which is a lovely little preschool close to us that's just as close to home education as you can possibly get. It's delightful, and I actually wish that we could use that more fully, so we might look at doing that. And so that is quite a lot of childcare, and I'm really conscious that he's very tired, and that isn't a very slow pace of education for him at the moment, and he's only 3. So none of those settings are obviously educating him in a formal lesson structure. It's all very much learning through play, but I can see how tired he is, and I can see that it's not at his pace. So what I'm really trying to do is balance the rest of our time to be really around him and what he wants. And one of my big learning points recently has been that why do we need to do that? So I don't know about you, but I often have a plan for the day in my head, this is what I want to do, and the weekends come around, I'm like, right, I want to do X, Y, and Z today. And then you start trying to pull the poor child into your plan. Yeah. And I'm like, do you know what, 4 days of the week you're being you're actually being looked after by someone else in order to facilitate my plan around my career. So the least I can do is make sure that the time we have together that's not work is led by you. Because I think that has to be the balance. And I think further down the line, in a year's time, when he will be about to start school, if that's still the route we take, that's going to be even more important, that kind of time that balances out. You know, I think one of the things I'm really keen on is that he gets to explore his special interest areas fully. So yeah, I haven't really got all the answers on that, but I think that I'm like recognizing at the moment with the amount of work we've got to do to the house, and you know, that we need my income to do that. And so there is a bit of a compromise at the moment around building the home that we want, and working to facilitate that, but also because it is my company, it's like it's an investment for our future as well. And I also have other people's mortgages to pay because I have a staff team, so it's not as simple as just being like, see you later. Because that puts other people in a really awkward position. And I have got a business plan that you know, over the next few years reduces the amount of hours that I'm spending in the business, and that's aligning like to other goals that we have as a family. So I suppose I would just really want to encourage people that it's you know, it is a privilege to be able to give up your career to home educate, and we're really privileged that it has been a consideration for us as well. And I suppose at the moment, slightly selfishly, and I'm really happy to put my hands up on that, from my husband and I, we're saying we value the income that I'm bringing into what it's giving our family. But it's a constant compromise that I wrestle with around, like, what does protecting my child from some of the things that we don't want him to be exposed to, how does that work when we get into schooling? And, you know, potentially, is it a case that we pay to provide him with an education that is different from what state sector offer? So that's a consideration. But yeah, as you can tell, that's a really long answer to a very short question. I'm really wrestling with it. And I think the biggest compromise for me at the moment is, you know, that the time that we have together is well spent. Like, that's what I need to make sure it's really well spent, and trying to encourage him in his interests, and also whilst also kind of resourcing my own time off has got to be restorative, hasn't it, as well, when you're not at work. So I haven't got all the answers.
I don't think we do. And like you say, like, you know, you brought up a really important point. You know, it's home educating the children, you know, from my perspective, you know, it is a privilege, and we're privileged that we have that one sole income that is enough to do that. And then at the same time, it's a sacrifice. You know, I have to sacrifice my career to be able to stay home with them. And you know, it's a very personalized and individual choice, isn't it? And I do little bits, like I do dip in and out, because for me as well, like, I find a lot of joy in the things I've done, and the things, you know, I hope to do. And that time is that for myself, having something that's just me, where I'm not like Amy the wife or Amy the mum, is really important. And so I do, you know, I do enjoy like dabbling little bits here and there, but it can't be, for our current plans, it can't be a full-time option. And you know, I don't have all the answers either.
But I think that makes a really good point, because when at the end of my maternity leave with Edward, I was really struggling with, I think my mental health wasn't brilliant at that point, partly because we were a year into lockdown as well as a year into parenting, and it just had not been the maternity leave I'd expected. And, you know, we've talked briefly about like some of the breastfeeding kind of trauma that I'd experienced, and there had just been a lot in that year. It had been a lot. And I found comfort and actually escape in going back to work. And initially, and I was going back to work in my own company, but going back to work a couple of days a week gave me that time to feel like me again. And I think that I do really love what I do, and that is a huge privilege. And I get that I have flexibility that I wouldn't have if I was in a traditional employed job. So I think that does help me with balancing the slow living aspect. But I do think at the moment there is something in there where I feel like I can, for me personally, I feel like balancing work and being mum, I am happier. And I think, like, I'm really surprised that I'm saying that, because if you'd have asked me a few years ago, I would have said the dream would have been to be at home full time with my children. But it's funny what happens when you're in it, really in it. So I think that's a really interesting point that you say, actually, you still need those elements that are testing your brain in a different way, and, doing the podcast and doing your blog and like the other bits of work that you do that gives you time that's like, this is me.
Yeah.
I certainly find that in my work. And when I've got a good balance, and I think we're just getting back into that now in these few weeks, the last few weeks, things have shifted slightly. It's that time to step away. Today I picked Edward up from nursery on the bike. So I cycled over, picked him up. It was a gorgeous evening. We cycled to the park. We had an ice cream. We played in the park way too late. But it was really precious. And I guess it's like, it was a why not? Why do we have to go straight home? Why do we? And so yeah, I think I think it's like quite brave as a woman to say, this is actually what I want. I'm not going to do what society expects of me. And I think that's really brave, and it's something I really value. And whilst I might look, because it's actually interesting, I have people roll their eyes that I've gone back to work as much as I have people who would probably roll their eyes if I didn't go back to work. So I don't think you can win.
No, I don't think you can. I don't think you can.
I think it just has to be like, how are you the best version of you? How can you be the best version of you for your children and for your husband, but also for yourself?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, parenting is a long game. And I think, putting your point earlier of like, things change as well. So you can only do the best that you can do today, for your children. And if that's being at home full time, or if that's balancing work and parenting, then like, great, you do the best job you can do that day. And sometimes that means a bit more Thomas the Tank Engine than we would ideally like.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think we can win. It's like, sometimes, if people say to me like, "Oh, is your daughter starting school this year?" Because she would be due to start in September. And I'm like, "No, I'm going to home educate her." And everybody looks at me like, "You're crazy." And it's like, I might be. I might be a little crazy. Who
But
knows?
I know
We'll
it's
see as we
amazing, like,
go.
the gift you're giving her in that space, even if it's for 2 years, even if it might be for 15 years, you just don't know. And we are really fortunate to be, there are lots of friends that we know who home educate. So there's a family in particular that I used to nanny for, who we used to sort of, I say nanny, it wasn't like a full-time nanny position. I used to go and help them in the holidays and things like that. And they live in the middle of Wales, in the town that I grew up in, and they have this incredible like hideaway homestead in the middle of the Welsh hills, and it's dreamy. And they home educated, and interestingly, the mum was a primary school teacher, and her eldest daughter started primary school at her primary school, and she pulled out Isabella and stopped teaching and went home and home educated, and then home educated the other girls that they had as well. And the eldest went to a traditional sixth form, and the youngest went to one of the Atlantic colleges, I think they're called. And then the youngest is still being home educated, and they've kind of dipped in and out of different types of education, and it's worked beautifully for them. And then the eldest went to traditional university, the second is at university at the moment, and I can hugely see the benefits to their kind of sort of, in the way that they've learned, and the way their special interests were kind of encouraged. And I think I said to my husband, and I said it like, all we can do is like look at the child we have at the time and say what's best for you this year. And if that means taking a year out and home educating and you know, or moving to a different type of provision, or blending somehow, like there are different ways that we're going to look at taking it. But I think at the moment, like I said, we're sort of leaning towards the him for the first, initially starting at the local primary school. Well, not our catchment, the next one over.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, you know, when it comes to like talking about slow living, like I think people think like you know, it's I don't know, you take a look on Instagram and everyone's like knitting and homemaking and you know home educating, and it's just not the choice for everyone. And I think sometimes then that makes people feel like they have to sort of adhere to this like certain like tick boxes, like oh you go to work so you're not homemaking. So you know when we're all homemakers, right, we're all doing it whether we have to work or not.
Oh, exactly that. And I really think it's not all or nothing. And, you know, I follow some amazing accounts where, especially American homesteaders who have like literally milking their cow in the morning. And I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's like my kind of little house on the prairie dream.
Yeah.
Um, but right now, the best I can do for my family is get the milk delivered from the farm, which is a mile away. Like that's my version of having my own cow in my back garden. I'm not
Yeah.
buying it without, you know, from a supermarket, but that's what our version is. And you know, like we talked about sourdough, you know, I love baking bread, but the best I can do right now is perhaps potentially just pick a brand that has less junk in it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it's just, I think just it's not all or nothing. And for me, like I said earlier, I think that it's that soul kind of what makes your soul happy. And slowing right down for me means lots of different things. And it might mean being in the kitchen for a day batch cooking so that I know we've got quick meals that are made from scratch in the freezer for the faster days
Yeah.
where I still want a bit of slow in there. It might mean saying, okay, my son's going to go to school, but here's what we're going to do around that to rebalance the kind of, you know, the scales on what he's exposed to and how he is encouraged and how we're living as a family. And yeah, I do think, and I think social media, whether we're not we're talking of slow living or like any other theme, social media is everybody's highlights reel.
It is. It
You
is.
know, and it'll be like the most perfect that their life can look, and but we forget that.
Yeah, do you know, I often have people say to me like, "Oh, your life just looks like really calm," and I'm like, "Well, it is calm on Instagram. Like, I don't know how I could portray the crazy, like craziness. Like, I have two children that are, you know, 4 and 2. There's no way that my life is calm."
So like I don't think any mother in history has had a calm toddler.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, yeah, I made a conscious decision a long time ago that I wouldn't share the ins and outs of my children's life too much. And so it's like I constantly battle with, you know, when I get a comment like, "Oh, but your life looks so calm and tranquil." And it's like, you know, yes, because I've made a decision for my children not to share their struggles and things like that. So of course it looks very tranquil, but you know, behind the scenes, like my hair is like and
That's really important. I mean, you and I do the same thing. We don't put our children's faces on public social media. And I also don't put a photo of him having a tantrum on the floor.
yeah,
And there will be, you know, and I've been posting less recently because I've been really battling with that whole, like, what do I share?
mm.
And wanting to share beautiful moments, the things that are making me happy, but also being really aware that effectively I'm just sharing a lot of like pretty flowers and baking. I think that is something to wrestle with, you know, the kind of if you're doing something, if you're selecting family values and you value protecting your child from certain elements of society and culture, how does that marry up with what you're putting on social media? And so I think you and I are quite similar in the fact that we recognize that that has to also reflect the values that we have for our families. And it doesn't, for me, it certainly doesn't mean putting everything on social media. And it does then mean you get a very curated
Yes, yeah,
Feed,
and
but I
it's
guess
not. Yeah,
is.
it's not intentional to make it seem like everything is just like hunky dory and we're having like, this fantastic homemaking, home educating life, but just that I don't want my children to have a digital footprint before it's something that they can consent to. I would just rather have them, you know, as just live their life like I lived mine and you probably lived yours. We didn't have our life documented for us. I don't want my children to show up on the internet at 16 years old and be like, that I've created this personality for them and they don't get to decide who they are.
Yeah, it's such an important point. And I do think even looking back at, when I was first exposed to social media, like MySpace when I was at secondary school, and then Facebook as I went off to university, so I was about 18, I think I wasn't old enough to make those decisions.
Yeah.
Like I look back at some of the things that you're sharing on Instagram. It wasn't Instagram then, but Facebook, and you're like, oh gosh, that
Yeah.
that shouldn't be the public. So I do think looking back on it now, one would argue you're not even old enough when you're a teenager, and that's going to be a whole other battle where we get to kind of the time where they want phones and things like that. But for now, all you can do is your best.
I know we're both really passionate about being outside as well, gardening and just, having our hands in the soil. In fact, before we were recording, we was talking about our plants. And I always love to see what you're up to in the garden on Instagram. But for me, gardening is about two things, I guess. Like providing for our family and being more sustainable is something since we got our allotment. But also it's a massive joy for me as well. And I notice how much more like rested and relaxed, and I just feel better mentally when I've been gardening. Like last year, I went through a period of quite bad health anxiety. And even my husband, when I came home, he was like, "You're a different person," like having been to the allotment. So how do you find gardening fits into like embracing a simple life? And what does it look like?
Everything you've just said, I totally echo. I think it's integral for me, I think, because I'm very fortunate we've got a garden here. I can step away from my desk because I work from home unless I'm on a client visit. I can step away from my desk and just have 15 minutes of like pottering around my plants. And I feel myself unwind whilst I do that. And this time of year is my favorite because it's light enough to go back out after toddler bedtime and just spend a couple of hours. And it happens without me even realizing it. I'll say to my husband, I'm just going out for half an hour. And 3 hours later, I'm like, oh, I can't see anything anymore. It's dark out here.
Yeah.
And it does, I think because you're doing something, it's very similar to how I enjoy sewing and making and baking and cooking. I think my brain is busy when my hands are busy.
Yeah.
So I can't think much else about what else might be bothering me apart from what's in front of me. And I love the simplicity of being rooted in a seed, some water, some heat, some soil, and you have fruit and vegetables. It's incredible. Or beautiful flowers. And nature is so resilient. And I just find myself really leaning into it as a way of relaxing. And oh my gosh, there's so much to do. I will never be on top of the garden. Never. And sometimes it doesn't work because I'm just making it up as I go along. And we're fortunate to have a vegetable patch as well, and I have, in fact, it's one of the things that I really think helps me to slow down with Edward is he loves gardening. I have to check myself though, because I'm now like, no, not like that, no, not like that. It's not like that. I'm like, okay, like that's fine. Dig that seedling up if you want to dig that seedling up. It's annoying. I'd really rather you do that. So I find him jobs to do, and he loves it. He loves helping in the garden. And what was lovely last year was it was the first harvest where he really got it. He was 2.5 and he suddenly connected the dots. He remembered planting the carrot seeds. He remembered planting the potatoes. And there we were pulling them up, going inside, cooking that food. And it was like 20 minutes until we were eating it.
Yeah.
And I just thought, this is magic. He gets it. He's really connected to the food that we're growing. But he also we're better people outside.
Yes.
Here we're just happier. We're both happier if we're outside and we're just pottering around with each other. So again, like I do know it's before we lived here, we didn't have a garden at all. We had we had a couple of pots on the balcony. Nothing as amazing as you're managing to do on your balcony, but this was the biggest thing when we moved here. I just went, oh my gosh, we have our own garden. This is so exciting. And being able to spend time out in it is, I think, really the center point of kind of slowing down for me. Also because I have really fond memories. My granny was an incredible gardener, and I know you have an amazing gardener in your granddad. Like, I love remembering the things she's taught me. And for me, like, slow living is a lot about generational knowledge sharing. I love traditional methods to things, whether that's cooking or sewing or cleaning or, and I think sometimes we do, rose tinted glasses back to simpler times. I think that is natural because we're in such a busy world. And of course, there are things that we have now that I would never swap. My washing machine.
Yes.
My dishwasher is very popular. But I do think that there's no point reinventing the wheel. And when we can pass down skills to our children, whether that's bread making or gardening or sewing or fixing things and DIY, like, that's a really important thing to do. And I really fondly remember the time that my granny, particularly because I was very close to her, was doing that. I didn't realize she was doing that at the time, but she was. And my parents are the same. They spent time at the weekends to teach us things. And I want that for my son and I. That only happens if we slow down enough to allow the time to teach and share. And for me, it definitely starts in the garden. We were talking, he said, "Mummy, look at that big pigeon." And he pointed to a magpie. Got a really long tail. I said, "Oh, it's called a magpie." And then he's like, "Well, what's it doing?" And he loves finding worms in the soil. We've got to leave these here. He says they're good for the soil. And you just realize how much they're soaking up all the time. So yeah, like, it's my therapy being in the garden, definitely my mental health and physical health. It's good for you, isn't it? Definitely something to do with our sustainability as a family. As much as we can't have livestock at the moment, we can have vegetables. And then there's definitely something in there about just the fact that it forces you to slow down. You have to be patient with gardening, don't you?
Yes.
You kind of have to give it what it needs, give it patience, and then wait and see what happens. And I think that in a world where we're so on demand, everything's on demand, Amazon same day deliveries and all this kind of thing, that it's quite a helpful lesson to have. And that kind of like generational knowledge sharing as well. I think if we don't work the land, if we don't look after it, and if we don't know how to keep our soil healthy, we're in trouble. And I mean, I'm a scientist by training, so the amount of reading I do around soil health and its relationship with nutritious food, and we've talked about this briefly before, and like, it's scary how important good soil health is to the nutrition of the food that grows in it. So yeah, for me, it's definitely like a holistic thing. It's not just that I like having a nice garden, because otherwise, I think we would be taking a simpler route. It's like we spoke earlier before you hit record, and I was saying about the bad gardener in me this year of I just haven't had time to plant things out, and now things need to be planted out urgently, and they're far outgrown their pots, and they haven't been hardened off, and they were chucked in the ground last night, and basically I said a prayer over them and was like, good luck.
This is what I did with my tomato.
My dwarf beans were looking at me like, we hate the cold. And I was like, yep, sorry, no time for hardening up. You're out here. You'll be fine. It's going to be fine. And hey, there's always a few more weeks in the growing season.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my tomatoes, I took them out of the greenhouse and planted them straight into the ground. And I planted them with some marigolds for like good companion planting. And then I was like, right, well, good luck. I will see you in a few days. Hold on in there. and they're fine. So I don't know that we need to do all this hardening up.
No, exactly. It's just a lot of faff. And some of those days which aren't that slow in our lives, we've just about got enough time to feed ourselves, let alone faff with taking plants in and out of the greenhouse. And one of the loveliest things last year that we went to was effectively our local village show, and I entered some of my fruit and vegetables into the show for the first time. And it was, for me, it was one of those days where I was just so happy. I'd picked a few bits and pieces. I'd, had no idea what I was doing. I entered them, followed the rules to make sure they were on the right size plates and all this kind of thing. Drove over in the morning, entered them with like a little thing of flowers that I'd done as well. And the flowers had all come from the garden. And I just said to my husband, I was like, this makes me so happy. This is kind of, for me, just being able to take part in things like this, which have been done in English, so English, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like village show where you have your fruit, veg, and flower show. And I'd won categories, which was just so exciting. I got a little like first. I mean, okay, I will admit that I think I was the only person who'd submitted chilies, but I won the category. Like my chilies had won. I think my carrots came second, my tomatoes. I was so like so simple, like simple happiness that day. It was just so fun. And we were saying to each other the other day, my husband was like, what are you going to do this year? What are you going to put in? And I said, the joy of it is you have no idea if you're going to grow anything worth putting into a flower show or a vegetable show. And I said, I'll literally decide like a few days before.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things about like gardening, isn't it? I mean, my greenhouse, this is the first year I've had a greenhouse, and it was absolutely brimming with stuff at one point. Now things are like, being chucked out. I'm like, right, guys, you're out of here unless you're like a real warm weather, like my peppers are still in there, my aubergines are still in there, but anybody else is sort of eviction notice. Like, I'm sure everyone can tell how much we love gardening.
Yes, sorry, we've gone off on a proper tangent now.
But it kind of leads nicely into like, we use gardening as our sort of way to sort of like decompress, and although it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily restful, it does have an element of rest to it, although it's not like kicking back with your feet up. And I think around like slow living as well, there's often this sort of misapprehension, isn't there, that when you live slowly you're just all like chilled out, and there's you're just relaxed and everything. And I know sort of like definitely this past winter I really like struggled just to find any sort of inspiration for anything, probably because of the weather. So how do you prioritize rest and slowing down in what is a crazy busy world?
If you ask my husband this, he will tell you I don't.
I think mine would say actually.
I think it's that realization, isn't it? And I'm getting better at this, and I think the way that I'm having to get better at it is because it nearly broke me actually last winter as well. Very similarly, I just was burnt out, and I was just making myself sick. And I think that that's not sustainable, and it's not teaching my son good habits. It's not giving anybody my best, and it's certainly not giving like the two people that deserve the best of me, which is my husband and my son, and they end up getting the brunt of me.
Yeah.
Not the best of me. So I think I think it has to be conscious. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that it's that recognition that no one else can do this for you. And that's been my big learning curve. Like, there will always be something else that I can be getting on and doing. There's always another email to send. There's always another bit of work to be done, but that's just not sustainable. And the balance won't come, because I think we live in a society where there's always going to be something else somebody can take from you, but you're the only person that is going to be able to say, I have to now fill my cup back up. And for me, definitely, like, the things that really fill my cup up are those slow living things that we can do, pottering around the garden, and like you say, it's not necessarily slow in terms of it being just one thing that's going to occupy you all day, but just for me it means finding the things that I can do from scratch, that I can do, that really like I can pour into, that are creative, that are wholesome, that are kind of life-giving. But as I said, there's always a reason why not to prioritize it. And so for me, it's that realization has really come this winter, because I nearly made myself very sick by not doing it and by trying to do too much. And I think as well, I'm becoming really cognizant of the way seasonal changes affect us and what we're supposed to be doing spring, summer, autumn and winter. And there are times in the year where there is more energy and more capacity for doing, like this time of year. And there are times in the year in the winter we're actually meant to be having a semi kind of hibernation period of restoration. And I think I'm just slowly starting to understand that. And that's probably something that we've lost as a culture, that understanding. We've got electric lights, we've got the internet, we've got all these things that mean that everything's accessible 24/7. And so should we be. And I think I'm just learning that. And I haven't got it right yet, but I'm learning that there is this cycle and rhythm of nature that we are part of as well. So I think, for me, to answer your question, it's got to come from me. And then it's got to be things that fill my cup back up and not drain it.
I think once you start to sort of realize, sort of like there are sort of natural ebbs and flows throughout the year, and I think once you sort of connect to that, you realize, we live in a world where we're expected to be at the same level for the whole 365 days of the year, and it's just not possible, and it's not natural. It's not actually how we were sort of made to be either.
No, exactly. And I do a lot of reading around how other cultures live, and as like I'm a real fan of attachment parenting and co-sleeping and breastfeeding, and it's very unnatural for many cultures to not sleep with their child. And so it's like that realization that there are so many things to learn from people all over the world. And just because something is done typically here doesn't mean that it's the thing that is necessarily going to feed you, and it might be a drain, but there are other routines and other things you can learn that might actually serve you better.
Well, Beckie, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast and share with us all the ways that you and your family embrace slow living. And like I said earlier, it's really important, to hear from so many different voices about slow living and how it just looks different for everyone. So just tell us, where can listeners connect with you online?
Thanks so much for having me. It's been such a joy. I'm at Our Nurtured Life on Instagram and ournurturedlife.co.uk.
Excellent. Well, thank you ever so much for coming. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thanks so much, Amy. It's been a great chance to chat.
Oh my goodness, what an absolutely amazing chat with Beckie. We could have talked all night long, and we actually did. But it just goes to show that there are so many different ways that you can embrace living a slow and simple life. It is not just this one size fits all. You don't have to do everything that Instagram tells you is slow and simple living. You can absolutely just tailor it to what feels right for you, and I think that's just the wonderful thing about slow living. So thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. You can follow me over on Instagram. My username is @lifeonplot44, or you can follow me on my blog, which is theslowlivingcollective.com. Thank you again so much for listening to today's episode, and I will catch you all in the next one.